They say that when love becomes an obsession, desperation leads you to do unthinkable things. I discovered this on that night in Mama Juana's cabin. The path to her home was a tunnel of twisted branches and foul-smelling garbage, as if the forest itself knew I was coming and wanted to stop me. The cold wind cut through my skin, but nothing could deter me. Life without Javier was hell, and I was willing to pay any price to bring him back. When I arrived, I saw the cabin, a rickety shell barely illuminated by the flickering light of a single spotlight, surrounded by vermin and filth. I knocked on the door, and it creaked open. An old woman stood hunched over, her dark eyes filled with something close to hatred. She was the infamous witch, Mama Juana. She didn't wait for me to speak. She only looked into my eyes, reading my desperation. Without a word, she stepped aside, and I entered. She closed the door behind me. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp earth, dry herbs, and copal. Jars lined the shelves, filled with things I preferred not to identify. Organic remains were visible, and one even contained chicken heads floating in a disgusting broth. An improvised altar covered with a black cloth stood in the center. On it were candles, small bones, and a cracked mirror. "Are you sure about what you want to do?" she asked, looking at me with a mixture of pity and warning. "Yes," I answered without hesitation. "Do what you have to do. I want the love of that man." "I warn you, forced love is not true love. What you ask for comes at a price, and there is no turning back." Perhaps she was too kind in giving me that warning. Doubt struck me like lightning, but the image of Javier embracing Karina, the woman who had stolen him from me, restored my determination. I clenched my fists and nodded. Mama Juana sighed and began preparing the ritual. She asked for something of Javier's, something that belonged to him. I pulled out a small lock of his hair, one I had secretly cut while he was still mine, on the last night we spent together before everything ended. She also asked for an object that carried my love for him. With trembling hands, I placed our promise ring on the altar, the only thing I had left of him. "The moon is in its waning phase," she murmured. "The perfect time to bend a man's will." She lit black and red candles. The flickering flames cast shadows that seemed to move unnaturally, as if something else was there with us. Then she began to chant, deep, raspy words in a language I had never heard before. Indigenous, perhaps. The air vibrated, the candles flickered violently, and a chill ran down my spine. Something was with us. "Place your hands on the broken mirror," Mama Juana commanded. "It is a window." I obeyed, though my fingers trembled like leaves in the wind. The glass was hot, almost burning. The air grew suffocating, pressing down on us with an unseen force. Then the reflection changed. It was no longer my face staring back at me, but a dark figure. Its mouth twisted into a horrible grimace. Its eyes weren't mine. They were completely black, drilling into my soul. "That is the spirit of the black man," Mama Juana whispered. "He will be the one to subdue Javier and bring him back to you." The figure in the mirror raised a hand. Though it remained on the other side of the glass, I felt a cold touch on my chest, right where the ring hung. The pressure intensified, stronger with each pulse, until I thought it would crush me. Then the entity spoke, its voice slithering close to my ear, whispering words I somehow understood. It had accepted the offering. The cabin suddenly fell silent. Mama Juana extinguished the candles with a single breath, plunging the room into total darkness. "It is done," she finally said, her voice weary. "Javier will return to you, but remember, such things are never free. There is always a cost." I thought she meant the money I had paid her. I wanted to ask what she truly meant, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I handed over the payment, gathered my things, and left, my soul divided between fear and hope. That night, I couldn't sleep. The face from the mirror haunted me, appearing every time I closed my eyes. Its words echoed in my head. The price had been set. The days after the ritual were a torment. Every night, I saw that face, its burning eyes seared into my memory, judging me. I told myself it would all be worth it once Javier returned. I couldn't forget how he had left me. I remembered every word of our last argument, a knife that never stopped cutting. "I don't feel anything for you anymore, Marcela," he had told me, his voice as cold as his gaze. The words crushed me. We had shared years together, promises, dreams, and yet he shattered them all with indifference. "Don't do this to me," I had begged, but he had already decided. He left with Karina, that perfect woman with her flawless hair and her fake smile. I had seen how she looked at him when we were still together, and now she had won. Javier had chosen her. The emptiness he left behind became an obsession. I couldn't accept that our love could simply vanish as if it had never existed. That's why I went to Mama Juana. That's why I did what I did. A week after the ritual, the unthinkable happened. It was a rainy afternoon. I stood by the window of my small apartment, watching the water carve paths in the street. As always, I was thinking of him. Then the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat. I opened the door, and there he was. Javier. He looked the same as always, but something in his eyes unsettled me. They were empty, hollow, as if a part of him was missing. He stared at me, unblinking. Then, in a voice that sounded distant, almost mechanical, he spoke. "Forgive me, Marcela. I made a mistake, and I want to get back with you." My mind was spinning. Was this real? Had the ritual actually worked? I felt a mix of relief, triumph, and something I couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was fear. I let him in, and although he tried to act like before, his behavior was strange. He hugged me, but his arms were stiff. He spoke, but his words lacked emotion. It was as if he were fulfilling a role that neither of us fully understood. At first, I tried to ignore it. I kept telling myself it was normal, that we just needed time to adjust to each other again. But the more time passed, the more obvious it became. Something wasn't right. There were nights when I'd find him awake, sitting on the couch, staring at the wall as if he were seeing something I couldn't. Sometimes he would mumble under his breath, whispering words that made no sense, as if he were speaking to someone who wasn't there. But the worst was the night I heard him crying in the bathroom. I opened the door and found him kneeling in front of the mirror, his hands covering his face. When he saw me, his expression was one of pure terror. "I can't breathe," he whispered. "I feel like something is listening to me, like I can't get out of myself." I tried to comfort him, but he pushed me away abruptly. His gaze was so desperate it left me paralyzed. "What did you do to me, Marcela?" That question hit me like a bullet. I couldn't answer. I couldn't tell him the truth. That night, I slept on the couch, unable to face what was happening. I realized the man who had returned was not the same one who had left. It was Javier, yes, but he was also absent, soulless, a shell of who he used to be. Something was consuming him, something I had unleashed with witchcraft. The following days became a spiral of fear and regret. Javier became more distant, colder, like a shadow of himself. And at night, I began to hear things when the house was silent. Footsteps in the hallway, heavy and deliberate. Something was watching. The air filled with a burnt smell I couldn't identify. One night, I woke up suddenly, a suffocating sense of dread in my chest. I looked toward the corner of the room and saw a dark figure, barely visible. I knew what it was before I could even move. I couldn't stop the scream that tore from my throat. I turned on the light. The figure was gone, but the burnt smell remained. That was the night I understood. I had made a terrible mistake. I had played with forces I didn't understand, believing I could force a love that was already lost. Now, something monstrous was chasing me. And not only was Javier paying the price, I was too. He began to fall apart before my eyes. Day after day, I watched him grow paler, more absent, as if his body remained, but his mind and soul had been taken somewhere I couldn't reach. At first, I tried to justify it. He told me it was stress, that he was still dealing with our separation, that he just needed time. But that was a lie, one that not even I could believe anymore. Then came the worst night. I woke to a strange noise in the living room. Javier was not in bed. I got up, heart pounding, and found him standing in the middle of the room, motionless, staring out the window. "Javier?" I called, shaking him. Suddenly he turned to me with inhuman speed. His eyes were completely black. His mouth opened wide and black worms spilled out. A scream that did not sound like his own burst from his lips. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor, my body frozen in terror. When I blinked, his eyes were normal again, but his face was still wrong. One of those worms slithered across the floor near his feet, writhing in a disgusting way. "They don't leave me alone," he murmured, voice broken, barely a whisper. I can't breathe. They are everywhere, Marcela. They are in my head. The worms, Marcela. I'm sorry. My head." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat curled up on the couch, knees drawn to my chest, listening to the noises surrounding me, convinced we were not alone. The next day, while Javier slept, I decided to go back to Mama Juana. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and regret. I hated her for what she had done, but I hated myself more for seeking her out in the first place. When I reached her cabin, I found her hunched over her altar, murmuring prayers. The setting sun filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls, and the smell of incense was stronger than ever. Mama Juana, something is wrong, I told her, my voice trembling. She looked up, and for the first time I saw something I had never seen before: fear. Marcela, I warned you that this was not a game, she said sternly. The forces I invoked are not benevolent. The Black Devil always demands a price. What price? I paid him what he asked, I cried, my throat tightening. Javier's will was bent, but his soul is trapped. It is caught between this world and the other. It is not. The Black Spirit has taken his consciousness. Only then could he return to you. Your fate is no longer with him because what you forced was never real love. Then how do I undo it? There has to be a way to free him. Mama Juana sighed deeply. Her hands trembled as she gathered herbs from the altar. We can try to break the spell, she said, but I will need more from you. Something powerful, something that truly matters. This spirit will not leave easily. Whatever it takes, I said immediately, though a knot of fear tightened in my chest. She looked at me gravely. Be careful with your words. Once you offer something, there is no turning back. I left the cabin with the instructions for a new ritual, one darker, more dangerous than the first. At midnight, I would have to offer a sacrifice, a life. A stray cat, Mama Juana had said, a living animal to seal the deal and free Javier. I struggled with my conscience all day, but in the end, desperation won. I found a small, skinny cat that often lingered behind my apartment. I brought it home, my hands trembling, my heart heavy with guilt. When midnight came, I lit the candles and followed Mama Juana's instructions exactly. I placed the cat on the altar. Its green eyes stared at me, innocent, trusting. Tears blurred my vision. Forgive me, I whispered. The cat's cry was brief, but it will haunt me forever. When the ritual ended, the air felt different, lighter, yet eerily empty. I returned to bed, exhausted, praying that it was over. Javier was still asleep, his breathing calm for the first time in days. But when dawn broke, my hopes shattered. A blood-curdling scream jolted me awake. I ran to the bathroom. Javier stood in front of the mirror. His sunken eyes stared back at me. His hands were bleeding. What did you do? He screamed. I looked at the mirror and nearly vomited. Javier's reflection was not alone. The dark figure stood behind him. The Black Devil had not left. It had grown stronger. It's taking me, Marcela, Javier whispered, voice breaking. And that was when I understood. There was no escape. The price had not been paid. And now, everything was lost.